The strange thing about destiny is, sometimes the person holding your heart in their hands is the same person connected to the pain that shaped your entire life. Rain hammered against the glass walls of St. Gabriel Medical Center as the trauma elevator burst open at 2:13 a.m. Nurses rushed through the hallway, their sneakers squeaking against polished floors while the sharp rhythm of alarms filled the air. Male, 38, internal bleeding, unstable vitals. A paramedic shouted as the gurney rolled past. Helicopter failure outside Cambridge. Possible cardiac trauma. Clara Whitmore froze for half a second when she saw the patient's face. Ethan Vaughn. Even unconscious, he looked exactly like the Billionaire magazines loved to photograph. Dark hair damp from rainwater. Expensive watch still strapped to his wrist. The cold kind of handsome that belonged on magazine covers and business billboards, not inside a trauma bay fighting for his life. Around her, senior surgeons exchanged uneasy glances. The bleeding's too severe. His pressure's dropping fast. We may not have enough time. Clara stepped closer, pulling on surgical gloves with steady hands even as her pulse thundered in her ears. Then she saw it. The silver emblem engraved into Ethan's watch. Vaughn Energy. Her breath caught painfully. For a brief moment, the hospital disappeared. She was 12 years old again, standing beneath a flickering streetlight in a tiny Appalachian mining town while snow drifted across cracked sidewalks. Her fingers had been numb from winter cold as she balanced an old biology textbook on her knees. Inside their trailer, the electricity had already been shut off again. Her father sat near the window wrapped in blankets, coughing into a handkerchief while pretending not to notice the blood staining the fabric. "You should sleep, Clara," he had whispered gently. But she remembered shaking her head. Doctors don't quit early. Her father smiled despite the exhaustion in his face. "Then promise me something. Promise me you'll leave this town one day." A loud monitor dragged her back to the present. Ethan's heartbeat stumbled dangerously on the screen. One of the surgeons muttered under his breath, "We're losing him." Clara looked down at the billionaire, lying motionless beneath the fluorescent lights. Vaughn Energy, the same company that had shut down clinics across coal towns years ago. The same company people blamed when her father was turned away from a regional hospital because he no longer had insurance coverage. The same name carved into every painful memory she had spent years trying to outrun. Yet now, somehow, fate had placed his life in her hands. Another alarm sounded sharply. A nurse looked toward the group of surgeons. "Who's taking the operation?" Silence spread through the room. Heavy, uncomfortable. Then Clara stepped forward. "Prep or 3, she said quietly. One of the older surgeons stared at her in disbelief. "Dr. Whitmore, this procedure is too risky." Clara tightened her gloves slowly, her expression calm even as old grief pressed against her chest like a storm trying to break through concrete. She reached into her scrub pocket and felt the small silver coin she always carried. Her father's lucky coin, worn smooth after years in her hand. "If we wait," she said softly, "he dies." Rain continued crashing against the windows as Ethan Vaughn was rushed towards surgery, and Clara walked beside the gurney with steady footsteps, unaware that before the night was over, the man she was about to save would change her life forever. The operating room felt colder than usual as Clara Whitmore stood beneath the harsh surgical lights, staring through the glass at the storm raging outside Boston. Rain streaked down the windows in crooked silver lines while the city glowed faintly in the distance. Inside, or 3, machines beeped steadily around Ethan Vaughn's motionless body. Nurses moved quickly, preparing instruments while the anesthesia team exchanged tense looks. Everyone in the room understood the same thing. If this surgery failed, headlines across America would explode before sunrise. But Clara was not thinking about newspapers or billion-dollar companies. She was thinking about a freezing winter night almost 20 years earlier. Back then, the town of Blackwater Ridge had looked forgotten by the world. Rusted. Trucks lined muddy roads. Coal dust clung to every porch and window. The old streetlight near the bus stop flickered constantly, buzzing loud enough to hear from inside their trailer. Most nights, Clara sat beneath it wrapped in her father's oversized coat with library books spread across her lap. While other kids slept, she memorized anatomy diagrams under pale yellow light because it was brighter than the candles inside their home. Sometimes snow collected on the pages faster than she could brush it away. Her fingers cracked from the cold, but she kept studying anyway. You know, normal kids watch television at night. Her father, Samuel, used to joke softly as he stepped outside, carrying 2 cups of instant cocoa. Clara would grin without looking up from her books. Doctors study harder than normal kids. Samuel always laughed at that, even when exhaustion hollowed out his face. He had once worked 12-hour shifts inside the mines before the closure started. Then the layoffs came. Insurance disappeared. Medicine became too expensive. Some nights Clara heard him coughing through the thin trailer walls long after midnight. Her mother tried hiding the overdue bills beneath kitchen drawers, but Clara noticed everything. She noticed how meals became smaller, how her father pretended he was not hungry, how the heater stayed off longer every winter. One evening, while wind rattled the windows hard enough to shake the trailer, Clara found her father sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a rejection letter from a regional hospital nearly 80 miles away. "They cannot take me without coverage," he said quietly, folding the paper before she could read the rest. Clara looked down at her science workbook. "Then I will become a doctor and fix people for free." Samuel smiled sadly at her confidence. "You are going to become something much bigger than this town, Clara." The memory hit her so sharply that she almost missed the present voice calling her name. "Dr. Whitmore?" A nurse handed her surgical gloves. Clara blinked once and returned to the operating table. Ethan's monitor suddenly dipped lower. One of the residents swallowed nervously. "Blood pressure is falling again." Clara stepped closer, her expression sharpening instantly. Beneath the expensive suit they had cut away earlier, Ethan suddenly looked less like a billionaire and more like a fragile human being balanced between life and death. For one strange moment, Clara wondered if anyone had ever truly cared for him without wanting something in return. She pushed the thought away immediately. "Scalpel," she said calmly. Thunder rolled across the city as the first incision began, and somewhere deep inside her chest, the frightened little girl beneath the streetlight whispered the same promise she had made years ago. Not this time. Not again. Hours passed beneath the bright surgical lights while rain continued pounding the city outside like an endless drumbeat against the hospital windows. Inside, or three, exhaustion crept quietly across every face in the room. Nurses rotated shifts. Fresh trays of instruments arrived. Coffee cups sat forgotten near computer monitors. But Clara Whitmore never stepped away from the operating table. Her focus remained locked on the fragile rhythm glowing across Ethan Vaughn's heart monitor. "Suction," she said calmly, though her shoulders ached from standing for nearly 10 hours straight. The resident beside her glanced nervously at the screen. "Heart rate is unstable again." Clara nodded once, already adjusting her technique before panic could spread through the room. Years earlier, fear would have swallowed her whole. Back when she was 17, she had stood trembling in the hallway of Blackwater Ridge High School, holding a scholarship letter with shaking hands. Boston Medical University. Full tuition. Housing included. She remembered staring at the paper while classmates whispered nearby. Some congratulated her. Others looked at her with quiet disbelief, like poor girls from forgotten mining towns were not supposed to become surgeons. That night, Clara walked home beneath the familiar flickering streetlight, carrying the acceptance letter pressed tightly against her chest. Inside the trailer, she found her father asleep in his chair, blankets tucked around him despite the warm summer air. His breathing sounded rough again. The old oxygen machine near the couch rattled softly. Her mother looked exhausted as she washed dishes at the sink. "The hospital called today," her mother whispered carefully. "Your father needs another treatment." Clara's smile faded immediately because she already understood what came next. They could not afford it. Samuel opened his eyes slowly when he heard her footsteps. Even sick, he still managed that same gentle smile every time he looked at her. "Did my future doctor get good news today?" Clara knelt beside him and handed him the scholarship letter without speaking. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then tears quietly filled his tired eyes. "You did it," he whispered. Clara shook her head quickly. "We did it." Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small silver coin he had carried since he was young. The edges were worn smooth from years underground inside coal mines. "My father gave me this when I started working," he said softly. "He said hard times never last forever." He pressed the coin into Clara's hand. "Now it belongs to you." Back in the operating room, Clara instinctively touched the same coin through the fabric of her scrubs while alarms suddenly rang louder around her. Ethan's vitals dropped sharply. The anesthesiologist looked up immediately. Pressure crashing. One of the senior surgeons stepped closer, tension tightening his voice. Dr. Whitmore, we may need to call this. Clara looked down at Ethan's pale face. Even unconscious, he looked exhausted, as though years of carrying enormous expectations had hollowed something out inside him. She thought about every patient her hometown had lost because someone gave up too early. Every exhausted worker turned away from hospitals. Every family forced to accept tragedy because help came too late. Her jaw tightened. No, she said firmly. We are not losing him tonight. The room fell silent except for the steady storm outside and the desperate rhythm of machines fighting to keep Ethan alive. Clara took a slow breath, steadied her hands, and continued the procedure while the silver coin rested against her heart like a promise she refused to break. By the 11th hour, the operating room had fallen into the strange silence that only comes when exhaustion and hope begin fighting each other at the same time. Outside, dawn slowly pushed through the storm clouds above Boston, washing pale gray light across the hospital windows. Clara Whitmore barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to the fragile heartbeat pulsing unevenly across Ethan Vaughn's monitor. Sweat dampened the edges of her surgical cap, and her muscles burned from fatigue, but her hands remained steady. Around her, the staff moved more quietly now, as though nobody wanted to interrupt the thin thread holding the billionaire to life. Doctor, we are losing pressure again, the anesthesiologist warned softly. Clara studied the monitor carefully. Something was wrong. Not panic wrong. Not chaos. Worse, the kind of subtle failure that slips through unnoticed until it is too late. Her eyes shifted to the imaging scans glowing nearby. Then suddenly she saw it. A tiny complication hidden deep near the damaged artery. Difficult to reach. Dangerous to repair. One wrong movement could end everything instantly. A senior surgeon exhaled sharply beside her. There is no safe angle. Clara did not answer immediately because another memory had already surfaced in her mind. Her first semester at medical school. She had arrived in Boston with one suitcase, 2 thrift store sweaters, and barely $40 left after paying for textbooks. While wealthier students spent weekends exploring restaurants downtown, Clara worked overnight cleaning medical labs to afford groceries. Some mornings she studied anatomy diagrams inside 24-hour laundromats because they stayed warm during winter. She remembered one professor in particular, Dr. Evelyn Carter, a legendary trauma surgeon known for impossible procedures and impossible standards. During one difficult surgical simulation, Clara had frozen under pressure while other students watched nervously nearby. You are thinking like someone afraid to fail, Dr. Carter had told her afterward. Great surgeons do not chase perfect conditions. They adapt. They see paths others miss. At the time, Clara had gone back to her tiny apartment and cried quietly into her pillow because she feared she would never be good enough to survive inside rooms where rich, brilliant people seemed born for success. But the next morning she returned before sunrise and practiced until her hands stopped shaking. Back in '03, Clara suddenly understood exactly what she needed to do. It was risky, experimental, the kind of maneuver most surgeons avoided because there was almost no margin for error. She inhaled slowly. Rotate the table 12 degrees, she said calmly. Confused glances spread around the room. Doctor, Clara pointed toward the imaging screen. The artery is collapsing inward. If we approach from the standard angle, the pressure will fail again. The older surgeon frowned. That procedure has barely been tested. Clara's expression never changed. I know. For one brief second, she imagined her father sitting beneath that old streetlight back home, smiling proudly the way he always had whenever she solved a difficult problem. Then Ethan's monitor suddenly let out a sharp warning tone. His heartbeat stumbled hard. Nurses moved instantly. We are crashing. The room erupted into motion again, but Clara's voice cut through the chaos with startling calm. Stay with me, she whispered under her breath, though she was not entirely sure whether she was speaking to Ethan, to herself, or to the frightened little girl who once studied beneath freezing streetlights believing hope alone could change a life. Then Clara made the incision that no one else in the room had been willing to attempt. For 3 terrifying seconds, the monitor beside Ethan Vaughn's bed released a single unbroken tone that seemed to drain all the air from the operating room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Clara Whitmore stared at the flat line while her gloved hands remained inside the narrow opening near Ethan's damaged artery, refusing to surrender to panic. Around her, the staff exchanged devastated looks. One nurse quietly lowered her eyes. Another surgeon took a step backward as though the outcome had already been decided. But Clara's mind drifted somewhere else entirely. She was 22 again, standing in a crowded hospital hallway during her residency while rainwater dripped from the sleeves of her coat after rushing across Boston in the middle of a storm. A patient from a low-income neighborhood had arrived too late for treatment because 3 emergency rooms turned him away while debating insurance approval. Clara remembered arguing furiously with an attending physician afterward. People are dying while paperwork gets discussed, she had snapped through exhausted tears. The older doctor had sighed heavily. You cannot save everyone, Dr. Whitmore. But Clara never accepted those words. Not when her own father died waiting for help that never came. Not when she spent years watching poor families treated like statistics instead of human beings. Back in the operating room, the silence stretched painfully while Ethan's monitor remained flat. Then Clara noticed it. The repaired vessel was not failing. The heart simply needed time to respond. Her jaw tightened with determination. Again, she said firmly. The resident beside her blinked nervously. Doctor. Clara looked directly at the team around her, her voice calm but unwavering. Again, another attempt began immediately. Seconds crawled by slowly enough to feel endless. Then suddenly, a small movement flickered across the screen. 1 weak heartbeat. Then another. The monitor released a sharp pulse as Ethan's heart rhythm slowly returned. Relief crashed through the room all at once. Nurses exhaled shakily. Someone near the back whispered, "Oh my God." Clara closed her eyes for the briefest moment as emotion tightened unexpectedly inside her chest. Not victory. Not pride. Something quieter. The overwhelming exhaustion that comes when hope survives by inches. Nearly 12 hours after entering surgery, Ethan Vaughn was finally stabilized and transferred upstairs to the intensive care unit while dawn spread pale gold across Boston's skyline. Clara stepped into the hallway outside the operating room, feeling almost disconnected from her own body. Her legs trembled slightly from fatigue. A nurse handed her a cup of coffee, but she barely noticed. Through the glass wall overlooking the city, morning traffic had already begun, moving below like streams of light cutting through rain-soaked streets. Clara leaned against the window silently. Then she heard footsteps approaching. Dr. Whitmore. She turned to see an older man in a tailored charcoal suit standing nearby. His silver hair was perfectly combed despite the sleepless night written across his face. I am Charles Bennett, he said quietly. Mr. Vaughn's legal advisor. Clara nodded politely, too tired for formal conversation. Charles studied her carefully before speaking again. The board was preparing statements for the media before sunrise. Clara frowned slightly. Statements. In case he did not survive. Clara looked away toward the waking city outside. Charles softened his voice. You saved more than one man tonight, Dr. Whitmore. Vaughn Industries employs nearly 40,000 people. She absorbed the words quietly, though they brought her no satisfaction. Because somewhere deep inside, one painful truth still remained impossible to ignore. The Vaughn name had once destroyed her family, yet now she had fought all night to save the man carrying it. As the ICU doors closed softly upstairs around Ethan Vaughn, Clara slipped her father's silver coin back into her pocket and walked alone toward the hospital locker room, unaware that when Ethan finally opened his eyes, the first person he would ask for would be her. 3 days later, sunlight poured softly through the tall ICU windows as Boston finally recovered from the storm that nearly took Ethan Vaughn's life. The city outside glittered beneath clear blue skies, but inside St. Gabriel Medical Center, the Billionaire remained unusually quiet. Recovery had gone well according to every chart and scan, yet something restless lingered behind his eyes whenever nurses entered the room. He answered questions politely. He followed instructions. But every few minutes, his gaze drifted toward the doorway like he was waiting for someone. Late that afternoon, Clara Whitmore stood at a vending machine on the 6th floor, trying to convince herself to eat something besides stale coffee and crackers. She had barely slept since the surgery. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes, and loose strands of blonde hair escaped from her hurried ponytail. She stared absently at the glowing vending machine buttons while replaying the same thought she had tried avoiding for days. Ethan Vaughn survived because of her. The son of the empire she once blamed for destroying her childhood was alive because she refused to let him die. Dr. Whitmore? Clara turned to find one of the ICU nurses smiling gently. He is asking for you again. Clara blinked once. Again? The nurse nodded. You are the only doctor he asks about. Clara hesitated before following her upstairs. Something about that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. When she entered Ethan's room, the first thing she noticed was the silence. No television playing financial news. No assistants crowding around him with tablets and schedules. Just sunlight warming the room and Ethan sitting quietly against white pillows, staring out at the Boston skyline. He looked different awake, less untouchable. The sharp confidence people associated with billionaires seemed muted now, softened by exhaustion and the pale bruising near his temple. When he heard the door open, sunlight reflected off the Charles River in bright flashes of gold. Then Ethan spoke more quietly than before. I do not remember much about the crash. Clara folded her arms lightly. That is normal after severe trauma. Ethan looked down at his hands resting against the blanket. For the first time since waking up, his confidence cracked slightly. I remember thinking I was going to die. Clara's chest tightened unexpectedly because his voice no longer sounded like a billionaire speaking to an employee. It sounded like a frightened human being admitting something honest. Ethan exhaled slowly. And the strange part is, I was not afraid of dying. His eyes lifted toward hers again. I was afraid nobody would actually care. The room fell silent after that confession. Clara looked at him differently for the first time, not as the heir to Vaughn energy, not as the face connected to old pain, but simply as a lonely man recovering in a hospital bed. Then her pager suddenly buzzed loudly against her hip, breaking the fragile moment between them. Clara stepped back immediately, rebuilding the professional distance she trusted far more than emotion. You should rest, Mr. Vaughn, she said softly before turning toward the door. But as she walked away, Ethan watched her carefully with a feeling he had not experienced in years. For the first time since waking up, he did not feel completely alone. Over the next 2 weeks, a quiet routine slowly formed between Clara Whitmore and Ethan Vaughn inside the upper floors of St. Gabriel Medical Center. Every morning, sunlight spilled through the recovery wing windows while physical therapists guided Ethan through slow exercises across polished hallways overlooking Boston Harbor. Reporters continued gathering outside the hospital entrance every day hoping for statements from the billionaire CEO who had narrowly survived a deadly crash. But upstairs, the world somehow felt smaller and strangely calmer. Clara tried keeping emotional distance between them. She limited conversations to recovery updates, medication schedules, and rehabilitation goals. Yet somehow Ethan always found ways to pull her into real conversations. Instead, sometimes he asked about medicine, sometimes about her childhood, and sometimes he simply listened while she spoke, which unsettled her most of all because powerful men rarely listened to anyone. One evening after her shift ended, Clara stepped onto the rooftop rehabilitation garden to clear her head before going home. The city glowed beneath the fading orange sky while cool wind moved gently through rows of flowers planted for long-term patients. She leaned against the railing quietly, closing her tired eyes for a moment. You disappear up here a lot. Ethan's voice startled her softly. She turned to see him walking slowly across the rooftop with one hand resting against the railing for balance. He wore a dark sweater instead of a hospital gown now, though recovery still showed in the careful way he moved. Clara frowned slightly. You were supposed to have assistants during evening walks. Ethan gave a faint smile. You sound disappointed I survived surgery just to ignore hospital rules. Clara tried not to smile back, but failed. Ethan noticed immediately. There it is, he said quietly. I was beginning to think you forgot how to do that. The comment caught her off guard. For a second, the guarded expression she carried so carefully slipped away. Ethan stepped beside her at the railing and looked out across the skyline. You know, he said softly, before the crash, my schedule was planned in 15-minute blocks for nearly 6 years. Clara raised an eyebrow. That sounds exhausting. Ethan laughed under his breath. It was efficient. That is not the same thing. He glanced toward her thoughtfully after that. The rooftop lights flickered on one by one around them as dusk settled across Boston. Somewhere below, ambulance sirens echoed faintly through city streets. Ethan rested his arms lightly against the railing. What made you become a trauma surgeon? Clara stared toward the river for several long seconds before answering. Because when I was young, someone I loved needed help and did not get it in time. Ethan's expression softened immediately. Your father? Clara looked surprised. How did you know? Ethan gave a sad smile. You carry grief. The way some people carry photographs. Quietly. But it is always there. The honesty in his voice made something inside Clara shift uncomfortably. She had spent years hiding pain behind professionalism. Yet somehow this man saw through her too easily. She looked away first. You should go inside. It is getting cold. But Ethan remained where he was. Can I ask you something? Clara nodded cautiously. Ethan hesitated before speaking. When you first saw my name after the crash, why did you still save me? The question hit harder than she expected. For one dangerous moment, she nearly told him everything. About the hospital rejection letters. About the layoffs. About the bitterness she carried every time she heard the Vaughn name growing up. Instead, she looked down at the city lights below and answered quietly. Because once you are on that operating table, you stop being a billionaire. Ethan studied her face carefully while wind moved softly through her hair. Then what do I become? Clara finally met his eyes again, and for the first time since they met, her voice carried no distance at all. Just a person who deserves a chance to live. Neither of them noticed the figure watching silently from the rooftop doorway nearby. Charles Bennett stood partially hidden in the shadows, concern slowly tightening across his face because deep down, he already understood something neither Clara nor Ethan fully realized yet. The closer they became, the more dangerous the truth about the past would become when it finally surfaced. The following week, Ethan Vaughn was discharged from St. Gabriel Medical Center under strict recovery orders, though the hospital suddenly felt strangely empty after he left. Clara Whitmore told herself that was a good thing. Her life needed to return to normal. Morning rounds, emergency consultations, late-night surgeries. No more rooftop conversations with billionaires carrying wounded expressions behind expensive smiles. Yet somehow, pieces of Ethan lingered everywhere. In the quiet rooftop garden at sunset. In the untouched coffee he used to complain tasted like burnt cardboard. In the strange calm she felt whenever he looked at her like she mattered beyond her job title. Clara hated how much she noticed the absence. 3 days later, she was reviewing patient scans late at night when an envelope appeared on her desk without explanation. No stamp. No return address. Her name written neatly across the front. Curious, Clara opened it carefully. Inside was a single photocopied document from nearly 18 years earlier. Her pulse slowed instantly as she recognized the logo at the top of the page. Vaughn Energy. Beneath it sat an internal approval signature tied to the closure of rural medical coverage programs across several Appalachian mining towns, including Blackwater Ridge. Clara's stomach tightened painfully as her eyes dropped lower. Executive authorization, Richard Vaughn, Ethan's father. Beneath the document was another folded paper. A handwritten note. You deserve to know the truth before this goes further. Clara stared at the page while old memories rushed back with brutal clarity. Her father coughing into bloodstained cloth. Hospital phone calls ending in rejection. Her mother crying quietly at the kitchen sink after another denied treatment request. Suddenly the room felt too small to breathe inside. She pushed away from the desk and walked quickly toward the locker room, her hands trembling despite years of medical training that taught her how to stay calm under pressure. Inside her locker sat the old tin box she rarely opened anymore. Clara lifted it slowly and unfolded the fragile letter her father had written shortly before he died. The paper had yellowed with age, but his handwriting remained steady. Clara, if life ever gives you the chance to become something greater than pain, take it. Do not spend your years hating people who never truly knew us. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes unexpectedly. Before she could process anything further, her phone vibrated sharply in her pocket. Ethan. Clara stared at the screen while her chest tightened painfully. After several rings, she answered quietly. Hello. Ethan's voice sounded lighter than usual. I hope I am not interrupting your shift. Clara closed her eyes briefly. What do you need? A pause followed. Actually, I wanted to. Thank you. His voice softened. There is a charity dinner tomorrow night for the hospital foundation. I know public events are probably not your thing, but I was hoping you would come. Clara's fingers tightened around the old letter. Part of her wanted to tell him everything immediately. About the document. About Blackwater Ridge. About the years she spent resenting the Vaughn name without ever expecting to care about the man carrying it. Instead, she forced her voice steady. I do not think that is a good idea. Silence lingered on the line. Then Ethan spoke more quietly. Did I do something wrong? The question hurt more than she expected because she already knew the answer was complicated. Ethan himself had done nothing. Yet his family's empire still stood on top of memories Clara could never erase. She looked down at her father's faded handwriting once more before whispering softly, You do not understand what your name means to people like me. Another long silence followed. When Ethan finally spoke again, his voice carried confusion and something dangerously close to fear. Clara, what happened? But Clara could not answer. She ended the call gently, lowered the phone into her lap, and sat alone inside the dim locker room while tears slipped silently down her face for the first time in years, unaware that across the city, Ethan Vaughn was already beginning to realize the woman who saved his life might soon walk out of it forever. The next morning, Clara Whitmore called in sick for the first time in almost 4 years. Instead of driving towards St. Gabriel Medical Center, she found herself heading west beneath gray November skies with her father's letter resting silently on the passenger seat beside her. Mile after mile, Boston disappeared behind crowded highways until mountains slowly rose across the horizon again. By late afternoon, Clara crossed the faded sign welcoming visitors to Blackwater Ridge. Nothing had changed. The old diner still leaned slightly to one side near Main Street. Empty storefronts lined the roads. Rusted mining equipment sat untouched behind broken chain-link fences like ghosts from another lifetime. Even the streetlight near the old bus stop still flickered weakly against the cold wind. Clara parked quietly and stepped out of the car. For a long moment, she simply stood there listening to the silence of the town she had spent years trying to escape. Then another vehicle pulled onto the road behind her. Clara turned sharply, stunned to see Ethan Vaughn stepping out slowly in a dark wool coat, one hand still pressed carefully against his healing ribs. How did you find me? She whispered. Ethan looked exhausted, like he had not slept all night. Charles told me where you grew up. Clara's expression hardened immediately. You should not be here. But Ethan walked closer anyway, stopping beneath the flickering streetlight between them. Then tell me what I do not understand. Wind moved through the empty street, while Clara stared at him silently. Finally, she handed him the photocopied document from Vaughn Energy. Ethan unfolded it slowly. The moment he saw his father's signature, all color drained from his face. Clara folded her arms tightly against the cold. The clinic closures happened the same year my father got sick, she said quietly. The nearest hospital that could treat him stopped accepting families from this region after the coverage cuts. Ethan kept staring at the paper, unable to speak. Clara's voice trembled despite her effort to stay composed. He died in the back of an ambulance less than 20 miles from here because no hospital would take him. Ethan looked up slowly, pain filling his expression in a way Clara had never seen before. Clara, I did not know. I know, she whispered. That is what makes this harder. Silence stretched painfully between them, while the weak streetlight buzzed overhead exactly the way it had during Clara's childhood. Ethan finally looked around the town carefully for the first time. The boarded windows, the abandoned pharmacy, the broken sidewalks. My father built his company talking about creating opportunity, he said quietly. But standing here now, all I see is what people lost instead. Clara looked down at the old letter still clutched in her hands. I wanted to hate you after I found out, she admitted softly. It would have been easier. Ethan stepped closer, his voice almost breaking. And now, Clara slowly handed him the letter from her father. Ethan unfolded the fragile paper carefully beneath the streetlight, while cold wind rustled through the quiet street. He read every word in silence. By the time he reached the final sentence, his eyes glistened with emotion. Do not let Clara grow up hating the world. Ethan lowered the paper slowly. Your father sounds like a better man than anyone in my family ever deserved to meet. Clara felt tears burn unexpectedly behind her eyes again. Ethan looked around the forgotten town once more before speaking with quiet certainty. I cannot change what happened to your father. He swallowed hard. But I swear to you, Clara, I will spend the rest of my life trying to change what happens next. Weeks later, news stations across the country carried the same shocking headline. Ethan Vaughn announced the complete restructuring of Vaughn Energy's healthcare foundation, investing billions into rural hospitals, emergency clinics, and medical scholarships across underserved mining communities. The first new medical center opened in Blackwater Ridge 6 months later beneath strings of glowing lights and freshly paved roads.